ready for the second of this year's shiurim with our Emerging Scholar Fellow. Okay, so this is a project. This is the second year of our project Mayan, the Emerging Scholar Fellowship. We are supporting an emerging Torah scholar to learn how to teach adult education. And I just want to call your attention to this sheet. There's a bit of, if you're not already familiar with our program, we have more information here. And on the front is Neti's bio. I want to especially welcome Dr. Tammy Jacobowitz, who is our mentor. One of the mentors of this program. She is the mentor for Neti for this session. Dr. Jacobowitz is the, I guess it would be appropriate to call her the head of the Tanakh department at SAR Academy, and she does many other teaching types of teaching as well. She is a master teacher, and she is also writing a book on midrash of Vayikra. So it was just a very nice synergy that Neti wanted to talk about Korbanot from Vayikra. And thank yous. Thank you, of course, to Talia, our Director of Education and Engagement, to Leital Kaufman, I can't remember your name, but our other Mayan staff, who, between the two of you, make everything work well. And without you, this would not be happening. Thank you very much. Thank you to the committee, the Emerging Scholars Fellowship Committee, which is Sybil Levison, Debbie Tesh, Ziva Hassenfeld, and myself, who put a lot of work into making this happen as well. And to our board, the Mayan board, who has some of whom are here this morning and helping out, and all of whom have been very supportive of this program. I also want to thank our foundational donors who got this project off the ground, and to just say that this is a project that is funded outside of Mayan's normal operating expenses. So if this project speaks to you, donations are welcome. I also want to just mention that the next class is on Motzei Shabbat, March 16th, not like we originally publicized, which was March 9th, but March 16th, Motzei Shabbat, in a private home in Newton, open to women and men. So if you have a husband who's saying, why can't I come to these? This is the opportunity. Sign up soon, because we haven't quite decided how this is going to work, but space is likely to be limited. And with all of that said, I'm very excited to invite Neti to come and teach us this morning. And here come a few more people. Please come and teach us.
Hi everyone, good morning. Thank you so much for coming out here this morning. It's really great to see faces that I recognize as well as new faces. And I'm really excited to teach all of you and learn together with all of you this morning. Before I get into the content of the actual shiur itself, I want to just spend a moment talking about what I'm doing. Why did I choose as the topic of this series Korbanot? It's generally something that people, I think, avoid talking about, avoid thinking about. I was speaking to my brother-in-law, who's a rabbinic intern in a shul, and he mentioned how hard it is to come up with drashot when it gets around to be Sefer Vayikra time. And I think part of the reason that Korbanot are hard to talk about is because they're unfortunately unpractical for us, but I think also because there's a lot of details in Sefer Vayikra, and so things can get very technical and dry very quickly. But to me, those details are actually really what speaks to me. And I think that in a way, they're really sort of the key to uncovering a lot of the spiritual depth that's there. And when I was in my senior year of college, I wrote my undergraduate thesis on one of the Rav's works, or Soloveitchik's works, known as halachic mind. People used to think I was talking about halachic man, but it wasn't halachic man, it was halachic mind. And the argument that the Rav makes in that work was something that really changed the way that I thought about learning Torah and really made me start to get excited about topics like this. The argument that the Rav makes, I think, can be summed up just in the final line of the entire work, which is, out of the sources of halacha, a new worldview awaits formulation. that Rav Soloveitchik believed that a Jewish philosophy, those big ideas and the answers to those big questions, had to actually be built from the much smaller details of halacha. And so it might seem as though the details of where on the mizbeach do we place the blood of this korban has nothing to do with the big question of, what does it mean for a finite creature to react and to relate to an infinite creator? The Rav believed that piece by piece, using those details, we could build a big picture that would answer that question. And I think korbanos in particular, there are so many details, but when we actually take a step back to think about what it means to bring a korban, someone who brings a korban is choosing to stand before their creator. And the fact that there are different ways to do this, the fact that there are different types of korbanos and that they each have different types of procedures, tells us that there isn't one type of experience that we can have with God. There isn't one type of mood or feeling that we can capture. And so what I hope to do today, as we look at the Korban Shelamim together, is to try to understand, what is this religious experience? Why would someone bring a Shelamim? How do they feel after the Shelamim? And then hopefully we can walk away with something that's relevant to our lives and to the framework in which we think about our relationship with Hashem. And so now we'll move on to speaking about the Korban Shelamim. And I want to mention that there are 2 voluntary korbanot in the Torah, in the entire system. Everything else is an obligatory korban, but there are 2 voluntary korbanot. One is the one that we spoke about last time, which is the Korban Olah. And the other one is the Shelamim, which we're going to speak about today. And the first thing that I want to do in talking about the Shelamim is to talk about it in comparison to the Olah. And I want to do a little bit of a thought experiment with everyone here. I'm going to describe in brief what the procedure of bringing each of these korbanot looks like. And I want you to think to yourselves, as I'm describing it, which of these strikes you as the paradigmatic korban? Which one would you say, okay, that's what it means to sacrifice. That's what it really means to bring a sacrifice to God. The first one, the Olah, has its blood sprinkled on the mizbeach, and then has the entire animal placed on the mizbeach as well. Everything is consumed by the fire and ascends in a column of smoke to heaven. That's the Olah. It's pretty simple. The Shelamim is a little bit more complicated. The blood is also placed on the mizbeach. The fat also goes on the mizbeach, the chilav specifically, a specific type of fat. And then, when it comes to the actual body of the animal, 2 portions are given to the kohen, the chazeh and the shul, the breasts and the thigh, and everything else is retained by the owners and eaten and enjoyed by the owners. And so the question is, of these 2 korbanos, which would you point to, if you had to, of these 2 voluntary korbanos, and say, that's the paradigm, that's what a korban is really all about?
The Olah. We'll go with the Olah.
Yeah, okay, I think, raise your hand if you would also.
Straightforward. Give to God in some way.
Precisely, right? To sacrifice is, we think, to give something and to give something up. Yeah.
Well, I would say the Shelamim, because then you're participating with God.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Awesome. So we see, right, there's this tension. On the one hand, there's an idea of giving to God. On the other hand, there's this idea of participating with God. Exactly. And I think that this, anyone have any other thoughts about this? Okay, so I think that this tension, this question of what does it mean for us to be able to eat from the korban, and does that not take away and detract something from the sacrifice and the gift that we're offering to God, and is really at the heart of a debate between 2 different Tanaim, and that's what I brought for you in the first source, Rabbi Linzer and Rabbi Yossi. This debate can actually be found in 3 different sources with some slight variations. It's in the Bavli in Masachet Zvachim, it's in the Yerushalmi in Masachet Megillah. I brought you the version in the Midrash in Bereshit Rabbah. There are some slight differences, so when those differences are relevant, we'll speak a little bit about the comparison between them. And as we know, unlike many other halachic institutions, Korbanot were something that existed before they became a formal part of halacha. We find already in Sefer Bereshit, before Korbanot are introduced, people are on their own donating and offering Korbanot. It seems like there's some kind of natural religious instinct to offer something to God. And the question that Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Linzer are debating is what types of Korbanos were brought then. When people had this instinct, what was their instinct? What type of Korbanot did they bring? And so they say, Rabbi Linzer Amar, Hikrivu b'nei Noach Shlamim, Rabbi Yossi Amar, Olos Hikrivu. So it seems as though Rabbi Linzer thinks that they would bring Shlamim, and Rabbi Yossi thinks that they would bring Olov. But while that seems to be the simple meaning of this debate, it can't exactly be understood that way. Because if anyone was at the Ola shiur last time, we know that we saw many examples in the pesukim of people bringing a Korban Ola well before Matan Torah. When Noach leaves the Teva, he brings Olot to Hashem. When Hashem tells Avraham to bring his son as a Korban, it's an Ola, and the ram that's brought in its stead is an Ola. And so we'll see, and the commentators clarify this, that Rabbi Linzer agrees with Rabbi Yossi that Ola were brought. Everyone agrees that an Ola was brought for exactly the reason of, it's simple, right? An Ola is simple, it's sacrifice to God, and so everyone agrees that the Ola was brought. The question is, was a Shlamim brought? And Rabbi Yossi thinks absolutely not, whereas Rabbi Linzer thinks yes, they were. And they go back and forth through different pesukim, each trying to prove their respective view. And I want to focus, if you look down to line 6, on one particular challenge that Rabbi Linzer has to Rabbi Yossi, because this is going to really serve as our basis for starting to understand what the Shlamim is all about. So, the midrash tells us, Eitiv Rabbi Linzer Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Linzer challenges Rabbi Yossi. He's going to try to bring a proof that Shlamim were brought before Bnei Yisrael were given the Torah. V'haksiv, vayishlach es nari b'nei Yisrael, vayalu ulos, vayizbechu zvachim, shlamim laHashem parim. So it's actually quoting a pasuk that's coming in this upcoming week's parsha, in Parshat Mishpatim. There's some question about the chronology of this pasuk. For simplicity's sake, we're going to go with Rashi's interpretation, which is that this is happening right before Matan Torah, right before Bnei Yisrael receive the 10 Commandments. They enter into the bris with Hashem. They say, Na'aseh v'nishma, we'll do it, Hashem, we'll accept whatever you have to give us. And Moshe writes down what the Torah refers to as a Sefer HaBrit, a scroll of the covenant, and they bring these Korbanos, these two Korbanos. They bring Olos, and they bring Shlamim. And so what is Rabbi Yossi going to do with this pasuk? It seems that before the Torah was given, right before the Torah was given, Bnei Yisrael were bringing Shlamim. And so Ma'avid le Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina. So Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina reads it not as the word Shlamim, but rather he vowelizes it as Shlimim, the adjective of Shalim, which means whole, and he explains below Hafshet v'nituach, that there's a halacha that's learned in Sefer Vayikra, that when you bring an Ola, you have to cut it up into different parts and place those parts on the Mizbeach. So he says before the Torah was received, when they were bringing Olo, they would bring them Shalim, whole, onto the Mizbeach. Now, of course, this isn't the simplest way to read the pasuk. The simple way to read, the way that Rabbi Yossi reads the pasuk ends up making the pasuk very redundant, right? They brought Olos, they brought Zvachim Shlimim laHashem. The word, if this word really meant Shalim, full, it should go right after Olos. It should be describing the Olos. So we see that Rabbi Yossi is willing to deviate from the simple reading of the pasuk because he's very convinced by this idea that it just can't be the case that there were Shlamim before Matan Torah. And I think, to a certain extent, we can readily understand Rabbi Yossi's hesitance. Because until the Torah tells me that I have permission to eat from the sacrifice that I offer to Hashem, how could I have thought of that on my own? It's not a basic religious impulse. And I think that this idea can help us understand why this challenge from Rabbi Yossi is relevant even though we're moments before Matan Torah, right? You might say that at this point, Bnei Yisrael are Bnei Yisrael at this point, right? The Midrash is still referring to them as Bnei Noach, but they've already made a bris with Hashem. Why is Rabbi Yossi at that point still convinced that they're not Bnei Yisrael yet? And I think that the idea that they needed the Torah to teach them that they're allowed to participate in the sacrifice can answer that. But if you look at the other version of this midrash in the Bavli, which I didn't bring for you, but in that version, the reason I didn't bring it is because this challenge is just missing. We don't challenge Rabbi Yossi from this pasuk right before Matan Torah. And in source number 2, the Mara Hapanim, around 7 lines in, he's a commentary on the Yerushalmi, and he explains why it is that this challenge isn't brought in the Bavli. And he says, Afal gav de parsha ve'al Moshe amar alei el Hashem dichtiv hai krasham kodem aseres hadibros namra kitapirish Rashi b'ni mukei chomesh. So he explains that even though this is written before they got the aseres hadibros, mikol makom kfar nichnesu bebris kidichtivi krai sham v'shuv lo din b'nei Noach lahem. That according to the Bavli, because they already entered into the bris with Hashem, they no longer had the status of Bnei Noach. And so according to the Bavli, this isn't a challenge on Rabbi Yossi. And so what I want to do, and what I hope to do, is to eventually present a another complementary explanation of Rav Yossi that will answer why the Bavli believes that this isn't a challenge on Rav Yossi. Right? So we have two different versions of Rav Yossi. In one version, Rav Yossi says, up until they got the Aseres HaDibros, they could not have brought Shlamim. And now we have a version in the Bavli that we'll have to explain, and we'll hold on to it for later, that says that no, once they entered into a bris with Hashem, even before they got the Torah, at that point, they were already able to bring Shlamim. So we'll have to figure that out and leave that aside. But I think that this idea that there's not a natural religious impulse to bring a shlamim, and that shlamim is something that we need permission for, is expressed very clearly in a Gemara in source number 4, in a halacha from Rav Huna. Rav Huna has the following statement that when you read it, at first it sounds like it almost doesn't make sense. Rav Huna Amar, Shalmei ha'ovdei kochavim ulos. Rav Huna says that when a non-Jew offers a korban shlamim to be brought in the mikdash, we sacrifice it as an olah. So there is an idea, and the Gemara talks about it, that non-Jews can bring korbanos too. They don't necessarily have the same obligations as we do to bring certain korbanos, but when it comes to the voluntary sacrifices, they can also offer these voluntary sacrifices. But Rav Huna says that when they come and they say, I pledge this korban as a shlamim, we don't bring it as a shlamim. We bring it as an olah. And why is that? It's not because we're trying to trick them, pull something over them. Rav Huna explains, Ibait ima kra, v'ibait ima svara. He says you can either source this in a pasuk, which we're not going to look at, or you can source it in a svara, in just logical reasoning. And listen to this, I love the way that this is phrased. Ibait ima svara, uvid kochavim libo l'shamayim. What's the logic? That we assume that the non-Jew's heart is towards heaven. The non-Jew is bringing this korban because he wants to connect and bring a gift and sacrifice to God. Not because he's hungry and he wants to have a meal afterwards to feed his family with. And Rashi explains, right, that's the assumed kavana that he has. So even though he says shlamim, we just assume he must not actually know what a shlamim means. And I think that this really highlights the idea that olah is this basic religious impulse. But it leaves us with a big question. Because then, what is the shlamim? Is the shlamim just a compromise? Is it just that we have this option of volunteering to sacrifice to Hashem? And it's sometimes hard to volunteer to bring an entire animal. That's expensive. And not everyone can do that. And we want to have an opportunity for someone to a compromise, for someone who can't do that, to give something to the mizbeach, but leave the rest for him and his family to enjoy. So I think that's possibly one way of looking at the shlamim, but I want to suggest a very different kind of way, along the lines, sorry, what's your name? Naomi. So along the lines of what Naomi said. And that's kind of the big question. But I also have two smaller questions that I want to answer with this new model that I want to call your attention to. And the first one comes from source number 3. Because there's one instance where there's a Korban Shelamim mentioned well before Matan Torah that isn't brought as a challenge to Rav Yossi, not in the Bavli, not in the Yerushalmi, and not in the Midrash. And this to me was shocking. I was trying as hard as I could to actually find someone who would ask this question because I was like so struck by it. Why don't we bring this as a challenge to Rav Yossi? And the pasuk comes from a story about Yaakov. After Yaakov has heard that his son Yosef, who has been mourning for years, is actually still alive, he gathers together his family, he's excited for this reunion. He probably also might be having some mixed emotions because he probably knows or has a sense of what it means to be bringing his whole family down to Mitzrayim. But nonetheless, in this sort of mood of mixed emotions, Yaakov goes and he starts to travel down, and he gets to Be'er Sheva, and the pasuk tells us, "Vayizvach zvachim le'Elokei aviv Yitzchak," that he brings zvachim to the God of his father Yitzchak. So you might be thinking, the pasuk doesn't say shlamim. So what am I talking about? Why am I saying that this is a challenge? So the word zvachim, and we're going to explore this in the next section in much greater detail, but the word zvachim, while it is a generic word that sometimes just generically means korbanos, it's very often a specific reference to the Korban Shelamim. And you don't have to take my word for it. If you look at the commentaries there, Ramban has this whole lengthy discussion of this like Kabbalistic discussion that I did not fully understand about why Yaakov is specifically bringing a Korban Shelamim. Rav Hirsch talks about the Shelamim there too. So the commentaries generally understand that this is in fact a Korban Shelamim. And actually one of the challenges that's brought to Rav Yossi comes from this past week's Parsha, that Yisro, before Matan Torah, brings olos and zvachim. And if anyone saw the Rashi on the word zvachim from this past week's parsha, Rashi says one word. What is zvachim? Shlamim. Exactly. So we'll discuss that in greater detail, but for now, you'll take my word for it that Yaakov is bringing a shlamim. And so if Yaakov, well before Matan Torah, is bringing a shlamim, why don't we challenge Rabbi Yossi from this pasuk? And what would Rabbi Yossi say to defend himself? So I hope that this new model that we'll try to build of the Korban Shelamim can answer this question as well. And then finally, we have our remaining question from before, which is to understand why, according to the Bavli, Rabbi Yossi actually would be comfortable with the idea of Shlamim being offered before the Torah was given, as long as Bnei Yisrael had already entered into their bris with Hashem. And so, in order to answer the big question and the two little questions, I want to try to look more carefully at the name of this korban. Because very often, the name of a korban is a really easy way to understand what its purpose is. The korban chatas is a great example, right? Chatas means chit, means a sin. Why is a chatas brought? Because you sinned. Exactly. And ola, we discussed last time how the ola means to go up, and the korban ola totally goes up. It all ascends to the heaven. So what about shlamim? What does shlamim mean? And I want to point out that the name of the korban, the full name of the korban, is not shlamim, but zevach hashlamim. Now whenever the Torah discusses this, and this is true especially in our introduction to the shlamim in Vayikra and Tzav, it refers to it as the zevach hashlamim. And no other korban gets that designation. We never talk about a zevach ha'ola or a zevach ha'chatas. And as we saw in the examples, sometimes just the word zevach on its own, without shlamim, is enough to signify to us a korban shlamim. And so what does this word zevach mean? And why is it only used for the korban shlamim when it's being used for a specific korban? So I've heard from people that know more about Tanakh, I think, than I do, that sometimes if you want to understand what a word means, you have to look at the first place that it comes up in Tanakh. And that will give you a clue into its meaning. And so if we look in source number 5, at the very first place that the word zevach appears in the Torah, we have Yaakov again. This time it's Yaakov when he's running away from Lavan's household. At that point he gives up trying to actually come to a deal with Lavan. He has to run away in the dead of night. And Lavan eventually figures out that Yaakov ran away. And so Lavan chases after Yaakov, and they meet on the top of this mountain, and they have an altercation, which eventually ends in peace. They sort of make a peace treaty between the two of them. And then the pasuk tells us, "Vayizbach Yaakov zevach bahar, vayikra lechav lechol lechem, vayochlu lechem vayalinu bahar." So Yaakov brings a zevach on the mountain, and he calls to all of his relatives. They eat bread together, and they lodge on this mountain. Now, if you would have asked me out of context to translate Vayizbach Yaakov zevach, I would have probably said to you that Yaakov brought a korban. But there's no mention in the pasuk of Yaakov, or in the pesukim before, of Yaakov building any mizbeach to bring this korban on. And it also doesn't tell us that he's bringing something to Hashem. And so I think for that reason, Rashi gets clued in to what he says in his comment, which is that what does Vayizbach Yaakov zevach mean? Not that Yaakov brought a korban to Hashem, but rather shacha behimo lemishta, that he simply slaughtered animals as a feast. And so what's a zevach? A zevach, according to Rashi, is another word for a mishta, for a su'uda, for a feast, a celebratory meal of some sort. And already we understand why the korban shlamim, and only the shlamim, gets called a zevach. Because this is the only korban that has a meal. This is the only korban that we are allowed to eat from. And what's interesting is that the fact that this includes a meal is put front and center in the name of the korban. If this was really just a concession, a compromise, something that we were giving into, then it would be funny to have that as the name of the korban. It's possible, but I think the fact that we're putting it front and center of the korban implies that it's part of the purpose of the korban. It's not merely giving in to a certain reality. And if you look also in source number 6, one of the challenges that's brought against Rabbi Yossi in another version of this midrash actually comes from a pasuk that speaks about olos and zvachim. When Moshe is speaking to Paro, right, whenever Moshe asks Paro, let my people go, it's never just let my people go, it's let my people go and do what? bring korbanos. That's always what he says, interestingly. So, right, the Gemara is picking up on what types of korbanos he wants to bring, and it says zvachim and olos. So the Gemara says, hey, Rabbi Yossi, this is an example of a shlomim trying to be brought, not successfully being brought before Matan Torah. And there, Rabbi Yossi answers by saying, no, you're mistranslating the word zvachim. He says, zvachim la'achila ve'olos la'hakrava. That zvachim, he says, can just mean a normal meal. And that's what Moshe was asking for. We want to bring a korban. That's the olah. That's the only korban we know how to bring. And we also want to have a celebratory meal, a holiday in the midbar. But I want to draw your attention now to the Radak in source number 5, the way that the Radak reads the pasuk. Because I think that a zevach isn't just an ordinary type of meal. It's a special type of meal. The Radak says that what does it mean vayizbach? Asa seuda umishta kedei sheyochlu biyachad behefridam zemizeh lezikaron habris. That Yaakov makes this meal so that he and Lavan can eat together right before they separate from one another, lezikaron habris, in order to commemorate the covenant that they just made with one another. And this is similar, I think. I'm not so familiar with the business world, but from what I know, it seems like this is something that people do in the business world. That you have two partners that make a deal of some sort, and then afterwards, the way to kind of celebrate that is to have lunch, to have drinks together, to eat something together after that deal is closed. And why do we do that? Right? Why do you have a meal, a seuda, lezikaron habris, to kind of commemorate and solidify that? What does it add to the deal that was closed to then eat afterwards? Does anyone, I'm throwing it out there, anyone have any thoughts about this? Yeah.
It adds a sense of collaboration, of cohesiveness.
Exactly. I was thinking, right, how exactly along those lines, how you just agreed to certain terms. We both agreed we're going to take on obligations, but the fact that we're now sitting together to eat together tells us we've also formed a relationship. That beyond those obligations that we've just made, beyond the contract that we've signed, there's also a relationship, and celebrating and eating together really highlights that.
Also, after a wedding, you'd have that. After a wedding, and you, in one sense, formalize the relationship.
And after a bris.
Yeah, it's really true, right? And there's an idea of that as like a celebrating the mitzvah that was just performed, but I think also, especially with a wedding, when two families have really like coalesced and come together, and now they're actually acting that out by eating together and celebrating together. It's a great example.
It also just makes the event more memorable. I mean, literally, you remember it because it's, you had a party.
Right. And I think that's true. It turns it into an event, meaning it's no longer just the agreement, but now it's also an event that happened. Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And I think that this association between zebach and bris and covenant actually comes up in other places as well. If you take a look in source number 7, in Parshas Bo, right before Yetzias Mitzrayim, we speak of the zebach Pesach. Right, the Pesach that they ate in Mitzrayim is a zebach. And if we think about what happened in that moment, right, Hashem tells Bnei Yisrael, take this lamb, take the Egyptian god, and slaughter it. Risk your lives to slaughter this god and take the blood and paint it on your doorposts. And any family that's done that, any house that has the blood on its doorposts, that's shown their commitment to God, that house will be saved by God on that night. When God kills their oppressors, he'll skip over that house. And this, I think, is one of these dramatic moments of us proving our allegiance to Hashem, and Hashem in return choosing and proving his allegiance to us. And what are we doing when all of that is happening? When all of this drama is going on, Bnei Yisrael are in their homes, and they're eating a zebach. They're enjoying this feast together. And at the time when they're in Mitzrayim, there is no mizbeach. There is no mikdash. This hasn't yet become a korban. It's just a meal eaten together by the family. And very interestingly, and I think not so surprisingly, when Chazal discuss the halachos of the Korban Pesach, they say that the Pesach is patterned after the Shlamim. That it has the same halachos in a sort of basic sense. Obviously it has its own unique halachos as a Korban Shlamim. And so I would like to suggest that this idea of zebach can help a new understanding of Rabbi Yossi. That the reason Rabbi Yossi felt that a shlamim couldn't have been brought before Matan Torah is because Rabbi Yossi thinks that a shlamim is a meal that celebrates our bris with Hashem. And without the framework and the context of that relationship, it doesn't make sense to bring a shlamim. There's nothing yet to celebrate and to commemorate. And I think that explains to us why Rabbi Yossi thinks that the very first shlamim, maybe one of the very first shlamim that's brought, doesn't have to be right after the Torah was given, but rather can be moments before, when Bnei Yisrael were forming and formalizing the bris that they had made with Hashem before they actually received the commandments. And that's what's going to happen, what we're going to read about in this week's Parsha, where Moshe writes down the Sefer HaBris, and he takes the blood from these Korbanos and he sprinkles it onto Bnei Yisrael. He enters them into the covenant. And I think that this can also answer our question about Yaakov. Why is Rabbi Yossi not being challenged from the fact that Yaakov brought a shlamim? So I know we didn't go through all of the examples, but the other challenges on Rabbi Yossi come from Havel. They come from the very first Korban, which in and of itself is very interesting, or the first accepted Korban, I should say. He was copying his older brother, but it comes from Havel, it comes from Yisrael, and it comes from Bnei Yisrael when they're in Egypt before they've been formed into a nation. And all of these groups don't have a special covenantal bond with Hashem yet. And so it makes sense that Rabbi Yossi doesn't think they would have been bringing a shlamim. But Yaakov does have a covenant with God. God makes promises to Yaakov. Yaakov accepts obligations upon himself in response to God's promises to him. And so while it's an interesting question why all of the other avos bring only olos and Yaakov is the only one that brings shlamim, that's a different shiur for a different time. But either way, I think it makes sense now why Rabbi Yossi isn't bothered by this example of Yaakov. Because shlamim is an opportunity for us to commemorate, to celebrate our bris with Hashem through the eating together of this meal. And what we've been discussing up until this point are kind of these big moment shlamim. Shlamim that are brought at the formation of the bris. Right? The Zevach HaPesach that's brought the night of Yetzias Mitzrayim, that's when we started to form that relationship with Hashem. The shlamim that are brought right before Matan Torah, that is like solidifying the creation, entering us in to the bris with Hashem. But what about the everyday, day-to-day shlamim? What about just a person that's moved and decides to bring a shlamim? What are they doing? And so I think that here, what we have to understand is that they're trying to participate in and reenact that bris with Hashem. The bris is already there, they're not forming it, but they're reenacting and they're celebrating it. And they're doing this by bringing a korban that they can then eat in the presence of, and almost, so to speak, together with God. Did you have a question?
Yeah. What about, what kind of korban did Noah bring?
So Noah brings an olah right after he gets out of the teva. Which I think also in terms of just the idea of the total sacrifice, his life has just been saved. He probably feels this immense sense of dependence on God, and he sacrifices a korban olah. But I think that there's still one aspect that we haven't fully unpacked. Because it's true that we want to celebrate something. We want to, as Naomi said, participate in something with Hashem. And that's what a bris is. It's a participation. It's a mutual agreement. It's not just that we have obligations towards God. God in turn has obligations towards us. Both parties are obligated to each other. But aren't there other ways to participate besides for eating? There still seems to be something a little bit crude and I would say almost audacious about this idea that we're saying, yeah, this is the korban that we're bringing to Hashem. But we're also going to eat from it. It's a very basic, physical, animalistic function. And so why specifically is the korban that celebrates our bris with Hashem, why is that specifically done through eating? And to try to answer and unpack that question, I want to look at the second part of this korban's name. We spoke about why it's labeled as a zevach, but why shlamim? What does the word shlamim mean? So there's, I think, a relatively well-known midrash that relates the word shlamim relates the name shlamim to the word shalom. So in source number 9, Rashi quotes this midrash, shlamim shematilin shalom ba'olam. That this korban brings shalom, it brings peace into the world. And then Rashi goes on to say, and I think that here Rashi's picking up on the fact that the korban is in the plural, shlamim in the plural, so there's multiple types of shalom, of peace here. And so he says, Sheish bahen shalom lemizbeach, lekohanim, ulebaalim. That the korban is divided into 3, and there's shalom for the mizbeach, there are parts brought in the mizbeach, For the Kohanim, there are parts given to the Kohanim, and for the owners of the Korban, because there are parts given to them. And I've heard this midrash before. When I actually started to think about what it meant, I got sort of confused, to be honest. I don't really understand what peace has to do with anything. Peace, it's a nice thing, it's a good thing, but why does the Shlomim bring peace into the world? And what does it mean to bring peace between the Mizbeach, the Kohanim, and the Baalim? Is there some kind of competition going on, and Shlomim is solving that by giving each party, each of you got a piece, don't worry, it's okay. And so I was really puzzled by this. And I want to give everyone, in just a moment, the opportunity to just kind of turn to the person sitting next to you for just a minute and try to discuss, try to think, what could the word shalom be doing here? But before that, I just want to highlight that here again we see that the idea that the Shlomim is divided, that it's not all put on the Mizbeach, that's center stage in the name of the Korban. And here, it's center stage in the purpose of the Korban. Right before we suggested that maybe that's just a concession. Maybe the fact that we eat from the Shlomim is just because it's too hard to bring a whole animal. But we see here that if the Shlomim's exalted purpose is about this peace that it brings, that peace is possible precisely because the whole thing is an offer on the Mizbeach, precisely because we share it. So I think it highlights this idea that it's in the name. But now, why doesn't everyone just take a moment, turn to the person next to you, and, I don't know, what's shalom doing here?
Several ideas kind of coalescing. One is it's hard to think about shalom without shlemut, so the idea of being shalom by bringing peace at multiple levels, and that it's an equal opportunity participation mode, because we've got Hashem, we've got the Kohanim, we've got the body, and so you can only have something that purports shalom if it's entirely full. And just as an aside, no pun intended, but I guess pun intended, you feel shalom after you've shared.
Very good, I love that. And we're going to talk about the connection between shalom and
Can you
shalom.
repeat that? It was hard to hear back here.
Yes.
Or summarize.
Do you want to summarize real quick, louder?
We just couldn't hear back
Oh,
here.
I'm sitting with this wall over here, we have noise there. Basically, we were talking about the notion of shalom by itself. It's further enhanced by the notion of shlemut. And if you can't be shalom unless you've experienced multiple levels of shalom, if we're thinking about sharing the Korban in this way. And as such, there's also this equal opportunity moment where it's Hashem, like it's an equalizer. There's Hashem, there's the Kohanim, the Baalim, everybody's sharing together. So in those moments, there is a sense of peace and a sense of completion. And then I also made a joke. I said that you feel shalom after you've eaten your Korban.
Thank you.
Very good. And you don't have all the time in the world to eat it, so you really have to feel shalom. Anyone else? Any other thoughts?
It's important to remember how differently people regarded food then. I mean, now food, everybody can get food, save money. Anyway, but then food was much harder to come by, and sharing food really said, that you have common cause with these people. Same, why it's a symbol for a business lunch, that we have a common.
Yeah, it's very interesting. We see also in Navi, in a few places, like in Shmuel, that there's an idea of like a zevach mishpacha. We actually have that phrase in one of the Shabbos mirrors, I think. And that it's exactly like this notion of like, it seems like it was a once a year thing from what we can tell, where the entire family would decide we're going to come together. This was clearly like a rare experience, and they would say we'll come together once a year, we'll bring the shlamim, and we'll enjoy the eating of all of it together. Yeah, awesome. We're using your name back? Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. I mean, it says it brings peace between the altar priests and the owners, but it doesn't say anything about peace between the different people living in the country, the Jews living in the country. So I think for me, it's missing something, like not getting to the poor. I think the rich bring a big animal or something, but to me, it's missing something, and I don't think I quite understand it.
Yeah, I definitely hear what you're saying, and it is interesting, right? It's not speaking about a piece within all the different people. It sort of has these three very defined groups. There is, and we're going to hopefully speak about this a little bit more, there is an idea that the Kohanim, maybe they're not necessarily the destitute, but they do need our gifts of food. They don't have their own land, and they don't really have any way of getting food other than through Bnei Yisrael that are meant to sustain them. So I think in that sense, there is an element of sustaining others. Also, if you look in Devarim, in the pesukim that describe the bringing of shlamim as well as different other ties to the poor, there's like general pesukim there that just speak about, you should eat in Yerushalayim, you and the ger and the needy. So even if it's not necessarily, you're right, it's not here in the midrash, but I think that idea is there. There's actually a really, sorry that I'm answering in such a long way, but there's a really interesting approach of Rav Naftali Tzvi Berlin, the Netziv, who actually speaks about the idea of the Korban Shelamim as a rectification for interpersonal infractions, for aviru bein adam lamakom. He feels that it's like a way to work on one's midot to actually bring the Korban Shelamim. So I ended up going in a different direction, but I think that might be something also to look at to kind of fill in that missing piece for you.
I'll tell you, when you ask about why food or why eating, I think eating is a real basic human need. It's very physical. And by bringing it as a korban, then you're elevating the basic physicality of it and making it something more spiritual, or elevating it to something that you do with Hashem.
Yeah, amazing. I love that, and we're gonna see that idea, and we're gonna build on that idea. I think it's great. Any other shalom? Yeah.
Was meat allowed to be eaten outside of the context of Korbanot?
Amazing
Because
question.
if it was, then by bringing the Korban, you're actually giving of yourself, saying, I could eat this meat by just killing it and eating it, but instead I'm bringing it and sharing, essentially, which is a peace-promoting activity.
Amazing question. It's actually, like all things, a machlukas. There's a debate, although there's a debate between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva in the Gemara about, it's only confined to when Bnei Yisrael were in the desert and when they had the Mishkan. Rabbi Yishmael thinks that the only way to eat meat, to make it permissible to eat meat, was to bring the shlamim, whereas Rabbi Akiva disagrees. He thinks they were able to eat meat outside of the Korban context. But if you look in the pesukim in Devarim, it speaks about how Hashem says, when I extend your boundaries so that it's like too much of a burden to make you go all the way, someone all the way from Be'er Sheva to go to Yerushalayim in order to eat meat. So then I'll allow you, so then even Rabbi Yishmael agrees that at that point they were allowed to slaughter meat regardless. But I think you're making a very good point, right? Which is that this isn't necessarily the only way to eat. And the person bringing the shlamim is choosing to eat in this way that's bringing more people in. That's not just a selfish act about my own eating, but that's including the kohanim, the mizbeach, and also because of the time limit that I mentioned, because you can't just, keep leftovers in your fridge for a month. And remember, this is an entire animal, so I can't even really imagine that quantity of meat, but you have to invite people. You can't finish it on your own, really. So I think that's a great, excellent point. And all of these things, I think, can also help us to understand, in source number 10, a machluka between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. And I think that everything that everyone has said so far is an amazing way to explain the approach of Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, just to give a little bit of background, they're debating something that has to do with the obligations that we have when we do Aliyah L'Rega, when we go to Yerushalayim for a holiday. And there are 3 types of korbanos that you have to bring when you go to Yerushalayim. They're speaking about 2 of them. They're called the Olas Re'iyah, so that's a korban ola called the Re'iyah, and Shalmei Chagiga, which is a type of shlamim. And the debate between them is about what the minimum amount of money that you have to spend on each of these korbanos is. So Beis Shammai umrim, ha-re'iyah shtei kasef, v'ha-chagiga ma'a kasef. Beis Shammai, perhaps very expectedly, says on the ola that's going to Hashem, you spend 2 silver coins, we'll go with that translation, and for the chagiga, for the shlamim, you only have to spend 1 coin. And he explains simply, ha-re'iyah ola kula legavoha, ma she'in kin b'chagiga. Right, the re'iyah we should spend more money on because it's an ola, it's all going up to God, which is not true for the shlamim, which we're also eating on our own. But Beis Hillel disagrees. Beis Hillel omrem, ha-re'iyah ma'a kasef, v'chagiga shtei kasef. Beis Hillel says, no, it's the opposite. For the ola, spend 1 coin, but for the shlamim, spend 2 coins. And the Gemara asks, Beis Hillel, my time alo amri ke Beis Shammai. Why does Beis Hillel say this? Why doesn't he agree with Beis Shammai? And now we might have thought to say, Beis Hillel might just be introducing a leniency. Perhaps he thinks, yeah, ideally it would be best to spend all your money on Hashem, but if you want to, and for people that are familiar with some of Beis Hillel's other approaches, right, Beis Hillel seemed to be the kind of guy that would want to introduce this leniency and say it's okay if you want to spend more money on the korbanos that you're going to eat. But if we look at how the Gemara defends Beis Hillel, the Gemara makes it seem like this isn't just a leniency, that this is a principled position. That Beis Hillel says back to Beis Shammai, "De ka'amar t'ri'iyah adifa de ula kula legavoha," that which you said, that really an ula is better because it all goes to God, says Beis Hillel, adarabah. On the contrary, chagiga adifa de isba shtei achilos. That the chagiga, the shlamim, is better because it has two different achilos, two consumptions. And Rashi clarifies for us, mizbeach va'ada, that it's shared, that it's to God, but it's also to us and to people. And so again, for Beis Hillel, this quality of the shlamim, the fact that it is shared, is highlighting what makes the shlamim, in a certain sense, preferable to the ula. And the reason that I think that eating plays a role in this, I think this touches a little bit on what Naomi was saying, and it's an idea that the Rav develops in many places throughout his philosophy. I think there were other thinkers before the Rav that have strands of this. Rav Hirsch actually is a great example, but the Rav really was the one to speak the most about this and to really explicate it the most. And it's the idea which the Rav refers to as the elevation of the body. The notion that I'm sure we're familiar with, that Judaism doesn't ask us to totally separate ourselves from the physical part of us, but rather to elevate that physical part, to engage with it, but in a way that is refined. And the Rav, in source number 11, I want to just read a few of the sentences of how he describes it, because I think there's a particular approach and angle that he has to it that can really help us understand shlamim and tie in to the idea of shalom. The Rav says, what is the elevation of the body? It's the basic teaching of the entire Torah. Everything else is interpretation. Halacha aims to sanctify man's body, refine the bestial aspect of human life with all their lusts and drives, and raise them to the level of divine service. And he goes on to explain that this doesn't happen in what he calls the crucible of self-deprivation, by fully separating ourselves from the physical, but rather by taking it and channeling it to divine service. And he quotes the pasuk of, "You shall eat in the presence of the Lord your God." And he says, can there be two more extreme opposites than these? Eating and sacrificing to God, eating and being in the presence of God, how can one go hand in hand with the other? And he says, but it is nevertheless so. Because that's how the halacha works. The halacha tells us to eat, and to eat in the presence of God. The shlamim has to be consumed in Yerushalayim, in a holy and sanctified way. And in the final line, and this is what I really want to call everyone's attention to, he sort of explains why this is the case. By sanctifying the body, it, referring to the halacha, creates one whole unit of psychosomatic man who worships God with his spirit and body, and elevates the beast within him to the eternal heavens. So what the Rav is saying is that the reason that halacha directs itself to our physical existence is because it doesn't want us to bifurcate ourselves, to feel as though we have a spiritual side and we have our physical side. Rather, it wants to create one whole unit. Hashem is telling us, I want you and I want all of you. I want your human worship. And the way to kind of unify the physical and the spiritual side of us is for the halacha to address the physical side of us and to give it and stamp it with meaning and purpose. And I think that that's exactly what the shlamim is. Hashem is inviting us not to act divine for the day, but to be humans. He's inviting us to eat with him. To eat, the Gemara uses the phrase from the shulchan gavoha, from the heavenly table. He's saying it's okay, you don't have to hide who you are when you come visit my mikdash. You can be yourself, you can enjoy, you can get shalim and feel that celebration and that enjoyment. And I think that idea of wholeness and shlemut, as we said, is what the shalom of the Korban Shelamim is all about. And Rav Yitzchak Arama, who is a 15th century Spanish rabbi and philosopher, he has this commentary on the Torah known as the Akedas Yitzchak. It's a really fantastic, more sort of philosophical commentary on the Torah. And he has a discussion about what the word shalom means. Because he's bothered by this idea that Judaism seems to talk about how shalom is the best thing, it's the best bracha of all, it's the final bracha in Birchas Kohanim. And we even have statements that say that one of God's names is shalom. And he says if shalom is just about not having war, if it's just about making an agreement among people that were previously fighting, what's so great about shalom? And so with that in mind, he tries to suggest another interpretation of shalom. So if you take a look in source 12, he says, Hine l'shalom yomer hahamonian shehu haskama bin hakitot hamitkotetot tchila. He says the masses think that all that shalom is some agreement between groups that were previously fighting. V'hine be'emes lo hikiru et yofiav v'lo dibru b'shivcha. But he says, in truth, those people, they don't understand the greatness of shalom. They're not speaking its true praises. And he goes on to say a few lines down, Ha'emes she'in mitnai hashalom she'yehi sham ketata kodemet. There's no condition that peace has to be something that comes after a previous fight. Ulam inyanohu lahamid matzav kol hachalakim hahim al tochen hacharuz hahu haklali v'tikod tzurato v'tzivyuno. He says that rather, peace is simply taking all of the disparate parts in a situation and putting them in their proper place, having everything fulfill its proper purpose and its proper role. And he goes on to say that that's why Hashem is referred to as Shalom, because God is what gives each and everything its own purpose, and having this overall God that puts everything in that purpose, that tells us that there's harmony here, that these things are meant to work together and to go together. That's all through God, who is Shalom. And I think that might be what the Midrash has in mind when it says that Shlomim is about bringing peace to the world, and it's about peace with ourselves. Because when we bring the Korban Shlomim, because when we celebrate our bris with Hashem as ourselves, as uniting the physical and the spiritual part of ourselves in this celebration, that results in peace, in shalom. And we feed ourselves, right? But we also feed our family, and we feed the Kohanim. And so I think that this idea of the Zevach HaShlamim as celebrating the bris with Hashem through food can be able not only to explain Rabbi Yossi and explain why he felt that the Shlomim only began once we had a bris and a relationship with Hashem, but can also give us a perspective on Shlomim where it's no longer playing second fiddle to the Olah. They both have their sort of purpose. It's not that, now I'm saying, the Shlomim is actually better. They both have their purpose and their religious feeling that they're channeling, and both are special and have something that the other doesn't. And before I kind of bring everything together to close, I want to speak for just a little bit about the two other parts of the Shlomim. We've been focusing a lot on the fact that the owners eat it, and I want to just give a little bit of attention to the other two parts of the Shlomim, the fact that we give some to the Kohanim, and the fact that what we put on the Mizbeach. So as I mentioned previously, I think the idea of giving to the Kohanim really turns this not just into a religious experience, but into a moral experience as well. Because now it's true that the Kohanim eat from all other Korbanot, but the way that the Kohanim eat from the Shlomim is fundamentally different than in all other Korbanot. Because the Shlomim is the only Korban that doesn't have any kapara, any atonement in the pesukim. There's no sin that I'm being forgiven for when I bring the Shlomim. And so when it comes to the chatat, for example, the Kohanim eat the chatat, but the Gemara tells us that Kohanim ochlim uba'alim mitzchapre. That it's through the Kohanim eating my Korban that I achieve my atonement. And so when the Kohen eats my Korban, I'm the one who's benefiting. I need him to eat my Korban. I'm still not using him, but I'm still relying on him to do something for me in order to achieve my atonement. But the Shlomim is the only Korban where the fact that we're giving to the Kohanim is not achieving anything for us. It's purely the gift that we're giving for the Kohanim, for them to enjoy and to thank them for their service to us. And if you take a look for a moment, sorry to go a little out of order, at source number 16, there's a very surprising line in the Gemara in Chulin, where the Gemara in Chulin raises the possibility that even in our day-to-day eating of meat, maybe we should also give the chazeh and the shok the same portions of the shlomim that we give to the Kohanim. Maybe anytime we eat meat, we should always give those parts to the Kohanim. And the Gemara ends up rejecting it for technical reasons. They think it's not such a good argument. But I think what this highlights, the very possibility, is that we're not just supposed to think of shlomim in isolation. It's supposed to teach us about what it means to eat meat and what the proper way to eat meat is, even outside of the context of the Korban. So that even when we don't have a formal obligation to give to others from our food, we should still be doing that. And the Gemara raises the possibility that even when there's no mikdash involved, when there's no mizbeach involved, maybe somehow this giving to the Kohen should be part of that as well. And so that's on the Kohen side. What about on the mizbeach side? So very interestingly, if you flip back over the sheet, to sources 13 and 14, we mentioned that the two things of the shlamim that go on the mizbeach are the dam, the blood, and the chilev, the fat. And if you look at the pesukim that describe the Korban Shelamim, in Vayikra and Tzav, both times that the Shlamim is mentioned, the end and conclusion of the Shlamim being mentioned is a halacha that seems totally out of place. Vayikra and Tzav are very well organized. They're lists of korbanos. They're halachos that have to do with a specific korban that we're talking about. And yet, if you look in source 13, Pasuk Yud Zayin, after we're told about the Shlamim, we're told a halacha that has nothing to do with korbanos. Chukas olam ladorotechem b'kol moshvosechem kol chelev v'kol dam lo tochelev. That it's a law for all times, right? A halacha that exists anytime we want to eat meat, not only in the context of a korban, that we can never eat the chelev, the fats, or the blood of that meat. And so what's this halacha doing here? And so I think that here too, just as when we bring a shlamim, we have to give the blood and the fat to God, and we'll discuss in a minute why it's specifically those two things, the Torah is telling us right here that shlet's meant to have an impact on how we eat meat, even in our day-to-day lives without the shlamim. That in those eatings of meat also, we have to, even if we don't have a mizbeach to actually formally give it to God, we have to refrain from having the blood and the fat. So what exactly is all this with the blood and the fat? So the pesukim, in a different context, when talking about what the blood represents and why we can't eat it, it refers to the blood, the dam hu hanefesh. It is the life force. It says, lo tochlu hadam im habasar. You can't just have the meat with its life force still in it. Because then you're really, in a very grotesque way, taking a life. And the placing of the blood on the mizbeach, the Rav explains this very beautifully for anyone who's interested. I can send you the longer discussion. But taking that blood and removing it from the basar is our way of saying, life belongs to Hashem. That's not in our control. That's in God's domain. We can't eat, so to speak, take life into our own hands. And when it comes to the chilev, right, the chilev isn't just any fat. It's the English translation for it is actually suet. I was actually watching, I don't know if anyone's seen the Great British Baking Show, but that was the first time I ever heard that word suet being used not in the context of a translation of Sefer Vayikra. So apparently there's some kind of pie that you make with suet, I don't know. But it's essentially the fat from the animal that's not part of the meat. It's like that excess fat that it's around like the kidneys area and it sort of exists on its own. Lovely, I know. So the fact that we don't eat that, right, there's something that's like extra indulgent about that. That's like an excess. That's not something that we need to sustain ourselves. And so I think that here too, there's a certain element of refinement. We can eat it and we can enjoy it, but we can't overindulge. We can't eat this excess fat, this suet. That has to be given to Hashem. And to conclude, I think the shlamim not only has an impact on the way that we eat meat in our own lives, but if we look at the midrash in source 17, we'll see that it has an impact on all other korbanot as well. Now the first time that I read this midrash, I didn't understand it. I thought there was some kind of scribal error, a talmud sofer in the midrash. I actually found a commentary who said that, but I was like kind of unsatisfied because I wanted to actually understand it on its own terms. And I found that Professor Yonatan Grossman had an amazing way of reading this midrash that I found very satisfying, and so I want to share that with you. The midrash begins with a statement that we're familiar with. Im zevach shlamim korbanot, Rabbi Yehuda omer, kol hamevi shlamim, mevi shalom olam. Right? Rabbi Yehuda says anyone that brings a shlamim brings peace into the world. But then the midrash doesn't stop there. It goes on to say that this is not just true for the shlamim, but we're going to include all the other korbanos as well. It says, minayin l'rabos es ha'olah. How do I know that the olah also brings peace? And it explains that the olah is similar to the shlamim because they're both voluntary korbanot. So just as the shlamim brings peace, so too the olah. Then it goes on to talk about other korbanos, the bechor, the maser, pesach, chatas, asham. By the end of the midrash, every single korban has been included somehow on the list. And so I would expect that the closing line of this midrash would be, kol hamevi korban, mevi shalom olam. But that's not what the concluding line is. After including every single korban, we end off exactly where we started. The final line is Kol ha-mevi shlomim, mevi shalom le'olam. So what's going on? Why did we go through including every single korban only to come out with the same conclusion that we started with? So Professor Grossman explains that if you look at how each korban is being included, it's not being included on its own terms. We don't say, oh yeah, we know that the Ola also brings shalom because there's a pasuk that mentions shalom in the context of Ola. We say we know the Ola brings shalom because it's similar to Shlomim in this and that way. And the same is true, I'm not going to go through all the examples, but the same is true for all of the other examples as well. And so what he suggests is that at the end of the day, there's only one korban that really is the korban that brings shalom. And that is the Shlomim. But the experience that the Shlomim creates, that intimacy and relationship with Hashem that the Shlomim celebrates, that's a truth, like a theological truth of what it means to be a Jew and to have a relationship with Hashem. And so even though that's like saturated in the Shlomim experience, that then gets carried into all of the korbanos as a whole. There's some aspect of that in any korban that we bring because it's a truth and it expresses a truth in our relationship with Hashem. And I found this Gemara in source number 18 that I thought really could be the best sort of proof for Rabbi Grossman's way, or Dr. Rabbi Grossman's way of reading this medrash. Because, and with this we'll close. Because the Gemara is talking about a halacha known as tnufa, which literally means to wave. The korban is waved like up and down before it's placed onto the mizbeach. And there are certain pesukim that speak about the tnufa as though it's only done by the kohen. The kohen waves the korban. But in the context of Shlomim, it actually has only the owners waving the korban. I have bolded for you the pasuk, yadav taviena, that the owner should be the one who brings and waves the korban. And so the Gemara comes up with a compromise. It says, well, what do? We have the owner waving it together with the kohanim. And this Gemara that I brought for you is the Gemara that's kind of working out that compromise. What I thought was so striking is that we see how Shlomim is bringing something to all of the other korbanos. In all of the other korbanos, the kohen is the main actor. The kohen is the one who's doing tnufa and waving the korban. But Shlomim brings for us and actually tells us a halacha that then becomes true for all of the other korbanos, the idea of yadav taviena, the idea of the baalim, of the owners of the korban, participating and being part of this experience. And that's the impact that the Shlomim has on all of the other korbanot. So just to pull everything together, we started off by speaking about how the Shlomim is this unique korban. It's the only korban that's eaten. And at first we thought that this might just be a concession. It might be something that we just simply need the Torah's permission in order to eat. But then we also suggested that it might be that the fact that we eat from the Shlomim is part of its purpose. And we focused on the name of the Shlomim in particular, the Zevach HaShlomim. The fact that this is representing and celebrating our bris with Hashem, and that it's doing so in a way that makes us feel shalem and makes us feel whole. Because our bris with Hashem is a bris where Hashem comes down and says, I want you on your terms as you are, as human beings, to come and enjoy and have this meal together with me, Mishochan Gavoha. So, thank you so much for listening.